So this, I think, is a really deep and meaningful conversation, and an important conversation that we're going to be having today. As folks know, Fellowship of Reconciliation, we have never shied away from controversial issues, and yet this has been reproductive rights in relation to abortion has been a difficult issue for Fellowship of Reconciliation over the years. And I think it's important that we have this deep conversation, and I'm so thrilled to have Reverend Katey Zeh with us today. And before I introduce her, I want to actually start this call out on a personal level and talk about my experience, just to kind of set the stage, and I believe in not having shame over abortions. So I got pregnant unintentionally in my uh, mid 30s. I was getting divorced from my then husband, who is the father of my two children, and my children were just still in preschool. And the person that I was seeing, it was a lovely relationship, but there was no intention or desire for it to become something permanent, and was accidental, as that happens. And I think I knew quite early that I would choose to terminate the pregnancy. I was working, but also just getting ready to go on to graduate school for my master's degree in social work, and it was a lot to take care of my two kids. I had them full time, and I knew that I could not give the children that I had the future that I wanted to give them, the full future, and all of me, including being able to advance my career, if I were to bring an additional child into the family. And I cried about it, cried a lot about it. I prayed on it. And because I didn't want it to be something that was shame, that was affiliated with shame for me, I talked to my family. I talked to my father, asked him to come to lunch, and spoke to him about it. I said, I don't want this to be something that I do in secret and I feel like I should be ashamed of. And then I made an appointment at the clinic, and had it was New York State, and I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time there was a requirement, both a waiting period, and which was painful for me because I had made my decision fully, and yet so to still sit with that pregnancy, even though I had made a difficult decision, was hard. And they required as well to do a sonogram, and so I heard the heartbeat, and which honestly felt cruel in that way, and yet so I'm at peace with that. And I said to the clinicians at Planned Parenthood, I said, this is the life that I'm going to kill. And they both, kind of like jumped all the way back, and they said, we don't think of it that way, we don't think of it that way. And I said, that's okay. Like, and they were worried for me, and I said, that's okay. For me, need to like fully contemplate the decision that I'm making, and full contemplation of that decision is, for me, it was and so I needed to name that for myself. I needed to tell my family and um, be comfortable. And for me, I wanted to grieve in advance of the decision that I was making, because it wasn't an entirely unwanted child. I love children. I had always wanted to have more children, and I was physically very capable, but economically, I wasn't, and it would have taken from my two children. And so I pledged to myself that what I would have given to this other child, I would give to the two children that I had. So I chose a medication abortion, the abortion pill, and I had a friend come stay with me overnight and act as like a doula, take care, watch over me, take care of me, rub my back, so on. And it was it was a it was okay. right? It was okay. And I felt very loved and very cared for. And it was a couple days later, I think it was on a Friday, late afternoon, towards the end of the business day, I had a follow-up appointment at Planned Parenthood. And so I went in, not expecting it to be much. And I remember, my friend asked if I wanted him to come, and I said, no, I'm fine. And he so I went by myself, and I think my stepmother would have come as well. She had a long career working at Planned Parenthood, but it was just a follow up. The experience is complete. And I went in, and they did the exam, and they said this was incomplete and we have to do an immediate DNC, which is a vacuum abortion. And I said, oh, can I call a friend? I have the friend that was with me, or I have other friends that, I could call, or my stepmother. And they said, we don't have time. We're about to close. We don't even have 5 minutes. Like, we have to do this right now. And I held the nurse's hand under intense fluorescent lights and sounds, and had that experience. And it was difficult. And I think often, and I've thought so much since Dobbs has passed, since abortion has become illegal, and that, certainly abortions, are easier to do uh, without medical supervision now because of the abortion pill. And yet there are circumstances like that. And had I not had that full care, had there not been a follow-up appointment, I would have had no way of knowing that the abortion was incomplete, and I could have easily lost my life. And I think of that, often in these times. So that's my particular abortion story. And it's one of the reasons that um, this issue is very important to me. It's a very important issue to me. And yet I know in our Fellowship of Reconciliation community that not all agree with me. And there's a wide range of opinions and positions and feelings about it, really deep feelings about it. And we kind of came to a place as an organization a number of years ago, and I will share in the chat later our statement that we came out with, which is a very broad statement. It is pro-choice, not pro-abortion, but pro-choice. And we call for deep conversation, loving conversation with each other, where we hear each other, where we can hear where each other come from, and respect and love each other's differences, and where we also look to address the root causes of not why all abortions, but why many abortions take place, which is that we don't care for people economically, and we don't provide enough health care for people, and we have so much of our country in poverty, and there are so many, deep concerns, and nobody should have to have an abortion because they can't afford a child, which that is that is why I had the abortion I had, because and that isn't the world that we should live in, and yet our world is so imperfect. And so for me, very much, it is a need to be pro-choice, so that, well, first of all, so that all can have that choice, and but while we continue to work towards a world where it isn't so necessary. So with that, I want to introduce our esteemed speaker guest today, Reverend Katey Zeh, and she is from the religious community for Reproductive Choice. She is their CEO, and the religious community for Reproductive Choice, which she will tell us much more about. And I'll say I'm actually new to this community, but they draw on the power of diverse religious communities and reject the shame and stigma that religious conservatives have long attached to sex, sexuality, and reproduction. Reverend Katey is one of the top justice, the Center for American Progress. Whew, okay, just still taking some breaths. The Center for American Progress named Reverend Katey one of their top justice-seeking faith leaders to watch for on reproductive freedom. She guides their organization with prophetic vision, compassion, and heart. And she has written for many esteemed places, some of who many of us read often, from Religious News Service to Religion Dispatches and Sojourners. And she appears regularly in the media and is co-host of a podcast that I know I'm going to start listening to, and an author of 2 books, Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement, and Women Rise Up, Sacred Stories of Resistance for Today's Revolution. Katey, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ariel, for starting by sharing your abortion story with us. That is incredibly moving. And I heard so many other stories as you were talking, because you touched on so many themes that are so common, that the decision to end a pregnancy is often a parenting decision, that it is often influenced by just where we are in our lives, economically or in relationship, um, the mixture of feelings that people have when they go through the experience, but also having an inner knowing of this is what is best for me, even if it is difficult. And it resonates a lot with the stories that I tell in my book, A Complicated Choice. It is an abortion storytelling book, because I think when we talk about this issue, it is never abstract. But I think the way that the conversation happens, it feels very distant from the real people who are making the decision or struggling with the decision. So thank you for humanizing it by being willing to share your personal story and pushing back against that framework of shame and stigma that is so incredibly pervasive. And the way that we dismantle it is by being courageous enough to share. So thank you for starting with your story sharing. You don't have to get my bio right. I'm just blown away by your willingness to share. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. If you could start by just telling us a bit about the organization and how it came about and evolved.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you all for being here too. I should say that for this conversation. I know that this can be, a trickier topic. I don't know all the things that you all do, but this is one that I think people have a lot of feelings about. So thank you for just being willing to come and be in conversation. So we have a really fascinating history that I think has gotten erased to a degree that I always love to talk about, which is that before Roe versus Wade, there were clergy who came together starting in New York City to ensure that people who needed access to safe abortion care could get it. And so they formed what was called the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion. And it functioned from 1967 to 1973. And it really was in response to clergy seeing members of their community dying or becoming, not dying from unsafe abortion, or people just not knowing where they could go to get help. And they felt like, as their call as clergy people and lay people as well, that they needed to make sure that they were caring for their communities by ensuring that they could find a reputable healthcare provider who could get them the care that they needed. And they helped, the estimates are between 250,000 and 500,000 people during those 6 years. And it's a part of our religious history that I think we have forgotten about. And so I think it's just important to name that there have always been people of faith, including in ancient times, who have stood for reproductive freedom and human dignity. And the clergy consultation service is one example. And that those are our roots. After Roe versus Wade was the decision of the Supreme Court, the groups that had come together to form that network decided that they needed to continue working to codify abortion rights at the state level now that there was a federal protection. And they became what was then the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights. Then, as time went on, the mission expanded because, as you were saying, it's about so much more than just, does someone have access to abortion? Do people have what they need to create the families that they would like to have and sustain them, and flourish? So there are many, many other issues that come into play when we're talking about this issue. So then we became the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And then just last year, we rebranded to Religious Community because we felt like that word more encapsulates who we are now, because the coalition was made up of a lot of denominational groups that people just participate in spirituality differently now than they did in the 70s. And so we want to make sure that even people who feel like they're not part of a formal religious tradition, but who value this work and thinking about faith and our reproductive lives, have a place and home with RCRC. So that's a little bit about our history of who we have been. And, we find ourselves now in a time very much like the ones that the clergy consultation service was born from. In some ways different, in some ways better, and in some ways much worse. And we are now facing a reproductive health crisis in this country where fewer and fewer people can access abortion care anywhere close to where they live. And it's pretty dire. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to create the world that we want. When we have lost something, we can ask, what is it that we want to build in its place now that it's been dismantled? And so I think that's one of the questions that we're constantly asking ourselves is, what world do we want to live in? What does that look like?
Yeah, thank you. So, um, I wanted to ask if you could share a few different faith's takes on abortion. Because I know the Jewish take is quite different than, say, the Catholic or Christian one. We don't in Judaism, um, a person doesn't become a person until birth, and the life of the mother takes precedent over the life of the child. And so within Judaism, abortion is at times required if the mother's health is at risk. And that's in like Orthodox communities. In Orthodox communities, a rabbi would order, and that would be the case. And yet here we are in a country where that isn't represented. But if you could talk about just some different approaches.
Right. I think there's a real diversity that's not always represented in the public narrative that we hear, because I think that, to talk about Christian nationalism has constructed a narrative that to be a religious person, one, you have to be a Christian, and also that you have to be anti-abortion. And that's never been true. It's not true within Christianity. There are so many different groups within Christianity that have different understandings of any number of theological issues. There's a huge spectrum. And I was actually in conversation with a rabbi and two abortion providers recently for a podcast, and I was saying I'm kind of envious of rabbis who have this kind of clear answer, within the teachings, because I think for Christianity in particular, there's not that clarity. Some folks would argue that there is, especially within Protestant Christianity, there really isn't. And so we have to glean from the sacred texts, what are the values that we believe overall, and how do we apply them to something that frankly wasn't really discussed at the times that the Christian texts were being written. And so I think for me, when I look at the model of who Jesus was, for example, and the way that he interacted with women, one, he learned from them, but also he centered their needs and listened to them when he spoke with them. And so I think that, my role as a Christian minister in particular is simply to journey alongside people during their most vulnerable moments. And a pregnant person who cannot be pregnant for whatever reason is incredibly vulnerable. And so I know for me, when I interpret the texts, I see someone who lived with compassion and modeled love over judgment and compassion over judgment. And so I think that that's the call for Christians like me. For Muslims, again, I'm not an expert on any other tradition, but there actually is like more specific language around that kind of quickening moment of when fetal life shifts in terms of how it's valued and seen, and there's more clarity there, which I think you kind of see the progression of faith traditions developing in time, that there's more specificity around certain issues. And then there are other faith traditions that don't have a formal teaching at all. And I think, maybe there might be an official stance of a denomination or a religion that certain people got to decide, um, but the people within that community don't necessarily ascribe to that particular belief. And so I think it's just as personal and individual as anything else, that we all have the ability to have a conscience, that we decide what our values are, what resonates with us, and that is informed by our experience, our families, what we were taught, what we learn. So I think just affirming that there is no one position with any particular tradition is really important. And that's just as broad as any other issue that where we bring our questions about the meaning of life to. So I like to think that a lot of this, why we have so much division, is we're dealing with kind of the mysteries of life here. And there's some things that are unknowable. And I think there's a lot of discomfort for certain groups of people around embracing mystery. But gosh, that's where all the good stuff of life happens, is in the gray, not in the black and white.
You have a banner on your website that I've been thinking about since I saw it, and it says God loves people who have abortions. And I was wondering if you could explain that a bit more, and then talk about the spiritual care that the necessity for spiritual care and how that's provided.
It's funny, it doesn't seem like something that should be profound, but I think when some of the more vitriolic language shames and stigmatizes people who have abortions, and people are told, God will not forgive you for this. You will suffer for eternity for this decision. There's a lot of hatred in the name of God that is espoused towards people who decide to end pregnancies. And so affirming what I think is a very basic sacred truth of most traditions, that nothing really can separate us from the divine because we're created by the divine. And for some traditions, in the divine image, um, just affirming that people who have abortions are loved just like everybody else, and not in spite of their abortions, but just because they're human beings who are loved. And I think we were intentional around abortions, plural, because we don't want to stigmatize people who have needed to access abortion more than once for lots of reasons. And we also wanted to make sure that we're inclusive of people who do not identify as cisgender women who can become pregnant. And so there's a lot packed into that very short statement, but I think it really is about just affirming the sacred value of people. And I've counseled a lot of people who feel unlovable or worry that they're unlovable because of this decision. And so whatever we can do to affirm that you are valued by God and God is with you through this journey is incredibly important to us. And I think you asked about, I think there was a second part to your question.
About the need for spiritual care within
Oh,
abortion,
yes.
and what
Yes.
you provide that way.
Yes, that has become increasingly the focus of our work. It is not the only thing that we do, but my own experience, I got started in this work when RCRC came to my seminary and provided training to seminary students on how to journey with someone making a reproductive decision about a pregnancy, and I ended up volunteering out of Planned Parenthood within the clinic and the procedure room. And I experienced both what it felt like to be perceived as a patient and to receive the vitriol of people who identified as Christian just like me, and feel that stigma and shame. And then to see the sacred work that happened within the clinic by the doctors and the staff, and realizing this is where the sacred work is happening. It's not outside, yelling at patients. It's these caregivers who are really compassionate and showing up for people at a moment when they were very, very vulnerable and in need of care. So we continue that work. I was talking about the training. We do what we call compassionate care training. So anyone who thinks that they might be in a position to hear from someone who is making a reproductive decision to end a pregnancy, or who has and needs to talk about it, we want to train people on how to be that non-judgmental, compassionate presence. What questions do you ask? How do you hold space for people? What do you do if they ask you a tricky question like, am I going to hell for this? What are the tools that we need? And a lot of that has to do with doing our own internal work. And when we talk about stigma and shame, what I've realized is that we've all internalized shame and stigma about abortion. And so we all have to do the work of identifying that when it comes up, like the judgments that we have, and coming to terms with them, and hopefully replacing them with compassion, so that when we encounter someone's story that maybe makes us uncomfortable, that we recognize, this is my stuff, and my role is to center the person who is asking and in need of care. So the compassionate care training is something that we do regularly. We also have a whole site that I would love to share in the chat called Abortion's Welcome. That is a spiritual companion pro-choice site for people before, during, and after abortion. And there we link to practical support, legal support, medical support sites of our partners, text lines, hotlines that people can call if they want to talk to someone, but also spiritual resources for folks who feel like they can't go to anyone in their community and need to do some of that work on their own. We have, readings and meditations and songs and all the kinds of things that we might need to heal or move through something. We provide that at abortionswelcome.org. So that's specifically for abortion seekers. And we also bless abortion clinics and their staffs. And one piece that I've really recognized is incredibly important is providing for the spiritual needs of abortion providers and their staff. Because really starting with COVID, I think, is when we really felt how stigmatized they are. We knew that before, but kind of seeing the degree to which they were being harassed by people outside of the clinic just really intensified. And of course, now abortion providers are being prosecuted in certain states, or they're fearful of OBGYNs are fearful of just providing miscarriage management because they might be implicated for helping to terminate a pregnancy. Like these kinds of things that physicians are very well trained and have high ethical standards, and the laws that are being instated really handcuff them from being able to provide, in certain cases, life-saving care to their patients. And the ethical injury, moral injury of that is devastating. And so we want to make sure that the people who provide this care are also cared for by us, and they often don't have spaces to receive that care. So we also do that. So again, we just feel like answering the call of what is it that we need to do in this moment, spiritual care is really central to the work of our CRC these days.
As you were talking, I was remembering back when I was in undergraduate, and I think I was looking for an internship or something, and I went to a center that I thought was I thought it was abortion. I thought it was reproductive counseling, and I walked in and discovered it was um, anti-abortion. And then since then, including when I was pregnant and chose to terminate, I became very aware of those centers throughout and the way that they market themselves as
Yes.
a place to help uh, folks think through what they want to do, what is right for them, and provide. And when I made the choice to terminate my pregnancy, I had an incredible amount of peer and family and spiritual support to, like I said, I had lunch with my father and spoke with him about it. But that's not the case for everybody, and especially for young people. And yet we have these centers that look so welcoming and so nurturing in that way. And I wonder your thoughts on that and harm it may or may not do.
Yes. Crisis pregnancy centers are a real problem. They're unregulated. They are not certified health centers. Sometimes they don't have anyone on staff who is even trained as a nurse, but they will usually clothe themselves in lab coats and things to make it appear as if they have credentials. But they've been known to provide ultrasounds and give inaccurate readings, telling people that they're actually farther along than they are and that they aren't able to terminate anymore. So there's a lot of, I'm not saying, and they're not all created equal. I want to be very clear. I think there's absolutely a role for organizations that want to support people who want to continue their pregnancies or choose adoption. And there are pregnancy centers that do not provide abortion care that do some of that work. So I don't want to discount them altogether because, again, they're unregulated and they really run the gamut. But I think anytime you're using deception as your tactic to force someone into a decision, I find that completely unethical. And a lot of times our public dollars are actually supporting these organizations. So it's also a church and state issue that I think we should talk more about. But in general, I think, being very upfront when people are feeling vulnerable, and a lot of times these crisis pregnancy centers are built in poor areas or in areas where there are a lot of young people, students and things, that they're very much targeting those communities who might not have access to healthcare, um, you know, kind of deceiving them into thinking this will be a place that I can get help. But the help there's a lot of caveats with that help. And so I think it's just essential that we recognize that they're not being upfront about who they are or what they stand for. They often will set up shop right next to an abortion clinic. They will name themselves something that sounds like it is like an all options type place. So we just want to make sure that people feel like they're making an informed healthcare decision. And I think in most cases, crisis pregnancy centers are not that place.
Yeah. I don't know if you have as much expertise in this, but if so, if you could talk about the um the effects of not having reproductive choice,
Mhm.
in terms of domestic violence and in terms of the incredibly vulnerable state that pregnancy is on one's body and economics and so on.
Yes, not an expert, but I have done writing and research around these issues just because they're so intertwined. And I again, I was looking at a lot of these systemic issues for my book, A Complicated Choice, because I was telling individual stories, but I wanted to connect it to the larger kind of societal issues. And domestic violence, intimate partner violence was a theme among a lot of the stories that I heard and shared. And one thing that we know is that people who are already in situations where they're experiencing intimate partner violence and become pregnant, the incidence goes up for that person typically, as a just statistics wise. They will experience more intimate partner violence when they become pregnant. That has been studied. There's a great book on my bookshelf that I can't reach called The Turnaway Study, that I think is really a great resource for folks who want to see the data around what it means for people to be denied abortion care or to be able to access it and see what the impacts are long term. Um, so yes, definitely for intimate partner violence, economics too. I mean, I know this more just from talking to people, but at different times people struggle to pay for an abortion and then want to continue a pregnancy and then struggle to afford childcare and all of those things. So yeah, the financial burden of being a parent in this country is one that I know personally, and yeah, it can be very, very difficult. And I think going back to the intimate partner violence, a lot of times continuing a pregnancy will continue to tie that person to their abuser. And so, what I found with some of the storytellers was their decision and ability to terminate a pregnancy was what catalyzed them to be able to leave that relationship. Had they continued the pregnancy with their partner, they might not have been able to do so. um, Continuing a pregnancy when you have mental health issues or physical health issues are all exacerbated. I think we just don't talk enough about the real dangers of pregnancy and childbirth. I mean, I think we're doing it more because maternal mortality in the US has been increasing. While the rest of the world has managed to lower their maternal mortality rates, ours have been on the rise, especially among Black women in this country, regardless of economics or class, um, because of the racism that Black women experience when they go to the hospital. Um, but yeah, the risks to our health are things we can't deny. And the other thing that we should know, though, the people being denied care right now, some of them have very wanted pregnancies, and then something goes wrong in the middle of the pregnancy, either with the fetus or with the pregnant person, and then a termination becomes very important, and in a very specific timeline, because the longer you wait to delay care, the more severe it becomes. And so it's a really complicated issue. There are so many things that can happen within a person's life. You think about a pregnancy being 9 months. That's a long time. Many, many things can change during that time period. Relationships, jobs, economics, your health, many, many things. And so there isn't just, one answer here. We have to really consider that people are living their full lives and are pregnant in the midst of it. And a lot of things can happen that make sustaining a pregnancy impossible. And that's why abortion is so necessary and why it's so challenging that it's so difficult for people to access when they need it most.
Want to invite folks to put questions in the chat at this point, even if they feel like difficult questions. We are, I welcome here differences of view. And speaking of, I often hear a response when I talk about being pro-choice, that a fear that allowing abortions for those who choose them will result in forced abortions for um, maybe a child, that it will result, let's say, in eugenics of a sort, or that there will become a standard for that rather than um, something I don't think anybody wants to have an abortion. But and I wonder, like, if you have suggestions for how to navigate those conversations.
Mhm. Well, I would say that some people do want abortions, and that's okay too. Um, I think,
No, no, sorry, I meant like nobody says like I want to get pregnant so that I can have an
so
abortion.
that I could, oh, I've never heard
Yes.
that. No, that is very true.
Right.
But what I would say is that there are absolutely ethical questions to ask about abortion. I mean, these are ethical questions that should be asked. Um, I'm the first one to say these are important questions. And I would say all of the people I've talked to who have access to abortion care, we're having ethical conversations either within themselves, with their partners. It is a decision about what direction is my life going to take. It is meaningful. Um, and what I would say is that legislating these kinds of decisions is where we get into trouble. It's not to say that there shouldn't be these ethical questions and guidance, but when we start legislating who can have abortions and who cannot by people who, frankly, are not medical professionals or bioethicists, and even if they were, there's not one line that we can draw in the sand for every single person. And so I think that might be the excuse to want to put legislation forward to prevent certain things, but in doing so, you are then creating a barrier for someone who needs to access abortion care and cannot get it. And I think that we need to focus on the individual person who is pregnant knows best what they need, and they should be trusted, and they should have access to all of the resources and knowledge that they need to make that decision for themselves, but no one else should be making that decision for them. I think that is what it means to be human, is to be a moral agent, and to deny someone's moral agency is an infringement upon their religious freedom, their bodily autonomy, and their human dignity. And so that's what I would say in response. I try not to debate this topic because I think I often get caught in traps that, again, deal with the abstract. And again, I think the questions are important, but also we have to remember who are the real people who are in need of these services? What are their actual stories? And how do we make sure that we create an environment for folks to, again, experience human flourishing? I think we should lean that way rather than preventing against, extreme situations that we worry about. Because the majority of people, that's just not the case. Anyway, that's the perspective that I take. So I welcome the questions, but I think we just can't ask our legislators to codify them into the law for us.
And I think we cannot avoid that historically and still currently, these decisions are being made for the most part by people who are not able to get pregnant. And if you have thoughts on patriarchy and women's rights within the context of reproductive rights.
Do I have thoughts on patriarchy?
A broad question.
Oh goodness. Wow. Well, I grew up in a very conservative Southern evangelical community, and so I grew up with a lot of the language that I hear Christian nationalists use around complementarianism between men and women and what women's roles are to be. And of course, there's only like binaries, right? There's only men and women, and you have to be straight. So there's a lot of people who are left out, but I was exposed to a lot of that language growing up, and it very much was a way of exercising control over people who did not identify as cisgender men. And I think that, controlling someone's reproduction is a way of controlling their bodies and their lives and their futures. Um, Another really great book that I read that helps me understand this more fully I think it was written in the 90s, but Killing the Black Body. If anyone on the call can put that citation in the chat, just learning that it's about more than just abortion. It's about who do we want reproducing. And like if you look at the movement called Quiverful in the evangelical world, it is about white conservative Christian families procreating to populate the country. I mean, this is about control, control of bodies, but also control of politics and power and our future, dismantling our democracy. And it begin by controlling people's ability to reproduce. Thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn is our intern at RCRC this summer, and also Melanie, my communications director, is on. So I just want to say shout out to both of them for being here and for helping out in the chat today.
Being here. So I want to again invite folks to put questions in the chat because we can go ahead and start to wrap up soon. And oh, I just had a question myself, and there it went out of my head. The term reproductive coercion and where that plays, and I know it's intertwined with domestic violence, but what that is and how that relates to the necessity of choice.
Yes, that can take a lot of different forms. It can be, forced sex to force someone to become pregnant. It can be interfering with a person's contraceptive method or, discouraging them from using one. It can be coercing someone into continuing a pregnancy that they don't want. And some of these stories are in my book as well, because that was also a theme that where there was intimate partner violence, the pregnancy became another way to kind of control the partner who is pregnant. And it also makes me think of just an example globally when I was working with a nurse in a very rural part of Kenya who receives Depo-Provera, the long-term acting contraceptive for the women there, because using pills is you have to have access to clean drinking water and all of these things. So Depo's is a preferred method. And she had the husband of one of her patients come and accuse her of, interfering with their ability to become pregnant. And it was kind of a scary situation for this nurse to be in. And her response was, I don't know what to tell you, like, keep trying, which I don't know what to make of that, but just that even, that lack of privacy of a person who can become pregnant having a conversation with their provider about their contraceptive care. There's attempts, I think, in all sorts of ways to control their partner through reproduction. So those are just a few of the ways. I'm sure there are more. But yeah, all of these topics that we're talking about are intertwined. We talk about like any social justice issue intersects with reproductive freedom issues. It's just how we all live fully in our bodies. So anything that affects our bodies or, our social relationships is going to impact our reproduction too.
Yeah, so we do have a question in the chat. Gina's asking how to have a constructive conversation with somebody who is being quite directive that abortion is murder.
Yeah, that's difficult. And I think one of the ways is to become curious about this person's values, because I think when we start just exchanging talking points, it's very easy to not really humanize one another in conversation. And so I think when people are saying, I believe a fertilized egg is a full person, that abortion is murder, it's like, okay, this is a values conversation. Like, tell me more about your values. That's one way. Be curious, ask questions, because I think what you'll find is if you start poking a little bit, there will be a thread that will start to unravel, because honestly, these assertions, like, they're kind of nonsensical when you start asking logical questions. So not that that's the point, but just to kind of get curious. So they have to like explain where they're coming from because I think sometimes people haven't thought a lot about these issues. They have like their talking points that they've been told, but they maybe haven't thought about it very critically. So if you can be someone to just stay calm and ask questions and get curious. I think that's always helpful. And also, there's often stories attached. And what I found is that, one in three, 1 in 4 people who can become pregnant will have an abortion in their lifetime. It's not something that happens out there. This is something that happens within our communities. And even if people aren't aware, they know people who've had abortions. It might even be them themselves. I don't know. But we're very intertwined in this way. And so starting to exchange reproductive stories of all kinds, I think, can be a very helpful way to start humanizing the conversation. A lot of people, like with 23andMe and stuff, are like finding out about, cousins they didn't know, and all these family secrets are coming out, right? Like there are these stories that have been kept under the rug and pushed under the surface because of the shame and stigma and silencing that people really want to share. And so I think if you can get to a place of humanizing the conversation, story sharing, value sharing, you might actually find some common ground or connecting points where you're not going to lose the person. And you probably won't agree at the end of it, but you won't have pushed that person so far away that they won't talk to you again, if that is your goal. I think that there are certain situations where being very forthright about these are my values and this is what I believe, and I don't care to engage your talking points, that has a place. But if you're talking about maybe someone in your family or your community or your friend group, or I don't know, someone you don't want to pick a fight with, I think that there are times to just get curious and not feel defensive about your own position. Feel secure in where you're coming from and then really get interested genuinely in where they're coming from. And I think those conversations are what help move the needle for people. And I know I've changed my mind about a lot of things in my life because people were willing to ask me questions and hang with me as I struggled and wrestled with it, and I think there's just, if that is a gift that you have, the world needs that gift.
I often say to people I disagree with, or that, that I'm having an argument with, I think we have more in common than separates us. And I
Yeah.
think we can find those places where we're compatible and build from there.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, I think a lot of people would agree that no one should die in childbirth. I mean, I think that there are some things that we can get to values wise that get us closer to where we want what we want the world to look like. And maybe we're all working on it in different ways. I'm very happy to be doing abortion work. Not everybody will. But if I can work in tandem with someone who's saying, I want to prevent people from dying in childbirth in this country, I mean, we have a lot in common.
So I want to just thank you so much for this conversation. And I want to thank everybody who joined, and thank you for being present in discomfort and in difficult, very personal, right? Very intimate conversation. And we don't always have such intimate conversations as we do different kinds of political work, and it makes us human. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And our email address, info@rcrc.org, is in the chat. rcrc.org is our website. Please stay in touch. We would love to talk more. You can follow us on social media if you do that. And just thank you for being willing to have this conversation. And Ariel, I would love to stay connected and see if we can get into
Totally.
some good trouble
A
together.
100%. Let's stay connected.
Okay, I would love
And
that.
to everybody who was here today, links to your books and to the social media and the podcasts and all the different pieces, your email and so on. Thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.